Hello everybody and welcome once again to Every Movie Ever. I'm your host Eric, and this is the show where we are reviewing every movie ever made. Starting this week with Rad. Rad is probably the raddest movie ever made. I think that's fair to say. If you have never seen this movie, I can't say I'm terribly surprised. This is one from the depth of the 80s that I only saw recently thanks to Bad Movie Podcast, How Did This Get Made? And even then, this is not a movie that's available. This is not one you can watch on any of your popular streaming services. This is not one that's readily available to purchase on Blu-ray or DVD. This is a tough movie to find, but I'll tell you what, kind of want to find a copy for my personal library, especially if I can get it on like some weird, outdated video format, because I'm a weird nerd. But anyway, so Rad is the story of a small town dude who just wants to dirt bike. He loves BMX bike racing, and he gets involved in a BMX bike race along with his friend Lori Loughlin. This is a cheesy and dumb movie, but also kind of good. This is a movie that if I had found it earlier in my life, I would have by now seen approximately 79 times. Like, this is a movie that if you find this as a kid, I'm sure you saw it over and over again. I like the music. There's this weird sequence in the middle of it where there's a teenager, high school, middle school, whatever, dance at a gym, and our hero rides his bike. Look at me, I'm riding a bike. Rides his bike onto the dance floor, and then I think Lori Loughlin also has her bike, and they have dirt bikes in the gym, and they start dancing on the bikes. They're like back up on one wheel and bouncing around and dancing and hopping the bikes on top of stuff and riding them around. It is insane. There's also an insane thing in this called, to sanitize it slightly, called butt sliding, where apparently you just sit and slide down sewage runoff. What? Also, super weird police officer character in this, who's a real, I'm gonna get you kids. But then toward the end of the movie, there's a big city meeting about, how our local hero kid needs money, and maybe we should give him some money so he can compete. And he gives this big speech about, we gotta help these kids. It's so weird, and I kind of loved it. I think I might even be underselling it right now, but I'm gonna give Rad 3 very rad stars. Let's talk about Blockers, a new comedy from this past summer, and a real unusual comedy in a lot of ways, because this is the rare, hardly seen in the wild creature, the female sex romp. By which I mean this is, think about your why can't I think of the name of it right now? Think about your Porky's, think about your Meatballs, your Revenge of the Nerds, any of those sort of movies. But now, make the women the protagonists, and that's what you got with Blockers, as it's about a group of 3 female friends on one of the last nights of high school. And they have a goal they want to get to. I don't think I need to elaborate on that. And their parents, who include, which is a great cast of adults in this movie, including Leslie Mann, who's always fun, and John Cena, the wrestler who has proven to be comedy gold. They find out about the girls' plan, and they set out to try to disrupt it. The adults aren't the only great cast. The young women playing the leads are phenomenal. This is a very positive movie, a very upbeat movie, and really a very funny movie. I highly recommend it. I'm giving Blockers 3.5 stars. Want to talk to you guys about Crybaby. We saw this recently. I had gone on a sort of annual trip to a small town that we like to visit and saw a play there, as we do every year. And this year, the musical they did was Hairspray, and we enjoyed it very much. And a big part of what seeing Hairspray on the stage made me want to do was revisit the original John Waters Hairspray. And I did not have access to it, but I did have access to another similar Waters picture, and that's Crybaby. Another kind of 1950s set movie about, greasers and weirdos as versus the preppies at a high school. This is kind of entry-level John Waters. This is not as weird as Pink Flamingos or Female Trouble. right? This is one that arguably the family could watch and get that sense of the sort of the John Waters oeuvre of misfits and rebellion. It is still a fun and a vital movie. It is a good time to be had, and the cast of Misfits is terrific, particularly Kim McGuire as Hatchet Face, a woman who in real life had unusual looks but was a lawyer, a very successful lawyer. Here, you know, a true, wonderful John Waters misfit. Johnny Depp headlines this one, do with that what you will. There's some fun music in this. It is somewhat of a slight movie narratively, but that's all right. It's a good time at the movies. And again, if you're curious about John Waters, this is maybe one to dip your toe into the, I apologize for the pun, to dip your toe into the waters with. Crybaby, 3 stars. Look out, it's an action explosion! Gang, if you've been watching this show on any kind of a weekly basis, number 1, thank you. Number 2, what are you doing? Then you know that I've been working my way through finishing up talking about movies I saw on an airplane the last time I went somewhere. And I think the final movie I have to talk about is The Mummy. This is the one from the 90s that starred Brendan Fraser. Remember that guy? Encino Man? Yeah. And here's the deal with The Mummy. First off, again, if you've been watching a lot of these shows, you know that my favorite kind of a movie monster is a mummy. I love a mummy. But you are also aware that there are very few decent movies about mummies. And this is not one of them. I think the problem with The Mummy is that it is too, well, the first problem with The Mummy, where are the bandages? How are you fighting a mummy and he doesn't have bandages on him? Boo, The Mummy, boo. The other problem is that it's just too sincere. This is a movie that I think would be best done somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and it almost seems like it wants to do that, but then doesn't for some reason. This is a movie that would work much better, and I think in a lot of ways wishes it was Big Trouble in Little China, which is, you know, sort of the epitome of the tongue-in-cheek actioner. And as such, you know, thinking about the movie from that way, I think you could have had a thing here. If you had done this same script in a Big Trouble style, I think you could have had a movie. And along those same tokens, if you kicked out Brendan Fraser and cast your man and mine, Kurt Russell, oof, you would have something. But instead, this movie thinks it's Indiana Jones, which also has a little bit of its tongue in its cheek, but especially if you look at like Raiders, is a pretty sincere movie. And that's what this movie is going for, and The Mummy just can't pull it off. The result is a very pedestrian 90s actioner that doesn't really have anything too much to recommend it. Rachel Weisz is in this, and she's pretty good. She's not given anything to work with. And that's, you know, that's about what you can say about it. The Mummy, 2.5 stars. Now, we're calling all horror hounds. Well, horror hounds, tonight we are talking about Friday the 13th, the original. I've been checking these out lately. I have never been a big fan of the Friday the 13th series. It just has never particularly grabbed me, and this most recent watch through isn't really helping matters. Again, if you've been watching the show, you know I listen to a lot of podcasts and podcasts about movies, and I've started listening to a new mini podcast about the Friday the 13th series. I want to give a shout out here. In Voorhees We Trust, featuring the terrific Paul Rust and Matt Gorley. So started out my rewatch, of course, with the original Friday the 13th. And the big trivia about Friday the 13th, if you don't know it already, I guess we'll put a spoiler up for a movie that's like 30 years old, is that Jason, the notorious, iconic killer of the Friday the 13th franchise, is not in this one. Instead, the killer is his mom, as played by actress and, game show panelist Betsy Palmer. I'm guessing that there aren't a terrible number of you guys watching this program that have any familiarity with Betsy Palmer, but I know her, and my grandparents know her primarily as a panelist on No, not what's my line, not to tell the truth, you've got a secret. The 50s guessing game show on which she was always a super charming presence. Well, on this one, in this movie, she is Jason's mom who is killing off teenagers because she feels that the neglect of a different group of teenagers led to the death of her son Jason a decade or more earlier, even though, as it turns out, Jason isn't dead. And also, Betsy Palmer doesn't, as Mrs. Voorhees, doesn't show up until like the last 15 minutes of the movie. And that's one of the big problems with this movie, is that, it's set at Camp Crystal Lake summer camp. Teenage counselors have come in and they're killed off one by one. And a big part of the problem with this movie is that it tries to create its suspense by being a stalk and slay movie. By which I mean we watch a lot of stalking from the killer's point of view as the killer, follows the teens, stalks them, and then kills them. But the problem is that the teens never really know they're in danger. There's not really a discussion of the Jason story or that people have been dying or anything like that in this movie. The teens are largely caught unaware, and that, for me, really kills the suspense in this and makes it pretty boring, as most of the movie is spent watching somebody watch teenagers. One of them is Kevin Bacon. Do with that what you will. Ultimately, this is a pure Halloween knockoff. Halloween had come out earlier and been an enormous success. And Halloween starts with that terrific point of view sequence. And this movie said, let's make a whole movie of that. And to me, it just doesn't work. Granted, it worked well enough that it spawned a whole franchise. And some of the later Friday the 13th installments, we'll talk about them on the show, are at least pretty good. But I don't think Friday the 13th Part 1 is very good. And so I'm only giving it 2.5 stars. Now, let's all get spaced out. On this week's Spaced Out, we are admittedly not going to space, but it's science fiction, so cut me some slack. We are talking about Logan's Run. This is the movie that features Michael York as a policeman in a society where it is illegal to get older than, I think it's 30. I think once you turn 30, you's expected to die. And if you run, Michael York tries to catch you. And it's also the movie where the whole thing seems like it was filmed inside of a mall. This movie is 70s as fudge. Everything about it is 70s. The hair, the clothes, the attitudes. If you want a sci-fi movie that is the 70s, I guess you should watch Logan's Run. How 70s is it? Farrah Fawcett is in this movie. When is Farrah Fawcett ever in a movie? And you know what? That said, I kind of like this movie. It's campy and it's fun. In addition to Michael York, you have Jenny Agutter plays the female lead. She's pretty good. That's a real mind blower for you. If you, like me, are a fan of the terrific baby birth procedural Call the Midwife from the BBC and PBS, you know Jenny Agutter as the lead nun on that show, so it's super weird to watch her in this movie. The great actor Peter Ustinov plays one of the sole humans living out in the regular wilderness, and he has a ton of cats. He's playing this as a super crazy guy, and it's a very fun performance. You also have a weird robot named Box who wants to turn everybody into a popsicle. It's a weird movie. If you've never seen it, I kind of think you should. It's a movie that I find myself revisiting every 5 to 10 years, and it's a real hoot. Logan's Run, 3.5 stars. Now it's time for License to Thrill. This week's License to Thrill is Spectre. This is the most recent James Bond movie, certainly one I was very excited to go see. Skyfall is a movie that I have come to like quite a bit. But a couple of years ago when Spectre came out, I was still a little lukewarm on Skyfall. And I was thinking Spectre might now deliver on the promise set up within Skyfall. And what happened was that Spectre was a huge misfire, that only made me appreciate and like Skyfall more. So what are you going to do? Excuse me. Here's the thing. Spectre sort of looks at Skyfall and says one of the things that Skyfall did was it was an anniversary picture. Excuse me. It was an anniversary picture that took, some of the best Bond elements and, sort of revisited them and reused them in the sort of context of this anniversary. So Spectre decides to do kind of the same thing. What are the best of the Bond elements that we haven't used again? For example, an updating of the spectacular train fight from Russia with Love that, while it doesn't feel to me as great as the From Russia with Love one, is still pretty cool. And then also the return of Blofeld after all of these years and decades to bring that character back into it as a main protagonist. And to have him played by the terrific actor Christoph Waltz. The problem is that the movie ultimately fails. For one, it feels like a later day Pierce Brosnan movie, by which I mean it's very weird, silly and campy, which does not help anything. There's also this whole problem where they're trying to obscure, both in the advertising for the movie and then in the movie itself, that the bad guy is Blofeld. For some reason, they don't just want to come right out and say it. There's all this weird dancing around where the character has like an assumed name that he's using, and it doesn't make a whole ton of sense. It's stupid. It's a movie that doesn't work. One of the things, and Christoph Waltz is largely phoning in his performance. It's a very clunky narrative. About the only thing I can really suggest or recommend about it is Léa Seydoux playing the Bond girl. She makes an excellent female lead in this movie. She has a lot of agency. She's very capable. The movie sort of sets her up as a latter-day Tracy, who is the woman played by Diana Rigg that Bond marries in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And certainly when Bond exits the film with Léa Seydoux still a part of his life, you do hope that she, who's damaged in ways similar to him, that the two of them can find something together. But what they can't find together is a very good movie because, like I say, Spectre just feels like a misfire. And that's why I'm giving it 2 stars. And now it's time for nobody's favorite part of the show. This is the worst of the week. This week's worst of the week, Blues Brothers 2000. Do you guys remember when this movie came out? Here it is, the 90s, and all of a sudden, John Belushi is dead. But they still decide we're going to make a sequel to Blues Brothers. And we're not even going to replace him with Jim Belushi because Jim looked at the script for this thing and said, we're going to replace him with John Goodman and then some little kid and a couple of other guys. It's weird. It's real weird. I remember as a kid loving Blues Brothers so much and being both, like, this was the movie that made me realize that a sequel could be bad. This is the movie that made me realize that sometimes a movie would come out that in theory you should be excited about, but that you somehow weren't. Now that said, it is somehow watchable. It's completely aimless and completely pointless. It tries to sort of steal the narrative thrust of the original movie and retrofit that, but completely fails at it. You know, that original movie has that great, we're on a mission from God, we're going to save the orphanage plot, and this movie doesn't have that drive. It's kind of a let's get the band back together for reasons kind of a thing. This one's directed again by John Landis, who did such a great job directing Blues Brothers and made other movies that I really love, like An American Werewolf in London. Hugely disappointing here. About the only thing that I can recommend in this movie is the Ghost Riders number, where, again, in aping the original Blues Brothers, there's a country music number in the middle of this thing. And it's not as successful as Rawhide and Stand By Your Man in that great bar with the chicken wire. This is outside at some country music festival. It largely doesn't work, but as they sing, there's this cloud that forms above them, and then these skeletal riders that come out of the cloud. It's an interesting looking thing, and so, like, it's interesting, and it's about the only interesting thing in this otherwise bland movie. So that's the only reason I want to single that scene out. Otherwise, Blues Brothers 2000, 2 stars. And now it's time for the best of the bunch. For this week's Best of the Bunch, we have to go all the way back to the 1930s to find King Kong. The original, the undisputed champ. Listen, King Kong is a movie I have seen a handful of times, and I sort of have this idea in my head of, King Kong, that's a good movie. That's a good movie. It could be better. You know, it's maybe a little boring in places. And here's the thing, I don't know what I'm thinking, because every time I actually watch it, I'm smacked across the face with how great a movie this is. The pacing in this really is great. Yes, it takes a little while to get started, and you begin the movie on this sort of sea cruise, but that really allows the movie to build to Kong. And from the moment you find Kong, it becomes a breathless race of a movie. It's a movie that even all these years later, that 80, 90 years later, feels vital and exciting in a way that the more recent remakes don't at all. This is a movie that feels essential. I suppose there are some flaws in it. For example, the romance featuring Fay Wray and the guy leaves quite a bit to be desired, but it's such a small part of the movie that it's difficult to care too much about it. The movie was made by this guy named Marion C. Cooper, who, while he made other movies, never really made anything else of this stature. And I don't think ever really tried to. This is his magnum opus, and there is so much of him inside of it, including a movie director character that seems to be very much based on Cooper, that this is a movie, there are a lot of great Hollywood classic movies like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz and Casablanca that are true collaborative efforts. But King Kong really does, I mean, there's a lot of collaboration here, and a lot of people contributed a lot of things to it. Very important things, whether it's the effects or the script. But still, this is a movie that feels like it could have only at least started from the mind of this nut job. It is an amazing, amazing movie. If you haven't seen it in a while, or somehow never seen it, do yourself a favor and pick it up again. King Kong really is the king. 5 stars. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Every Movie Ever. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next time as we keep trying to review every movie ever made. And don't forget to visit our website, northmetrotv.com/everymovieever. There, you can watch reviews of every movie we've ever covered here on the show, as well as complete episodes. That's northmetrotv.com/everymovieever.